What happens when one man tries to watch all the horror films of the 1930s? Well, we're about to find out because I'm your host, Josh Spiegel, and my co-host, Stella Spiegel, and this is the 30s Project. Believe it or not, but we're already in 1936, and there's only 2 episodes left of the 30s Project. This episode's going to cover 1936 and 1937, and the next episode, the final one, is going to cover 38 and 39. And by this point in a decade, we've already seen most of the big guns of the Universal slate be unleashed, but there's still some more room in here for some zombies, some vampires, dolls,
and a giant octopus.
And a giant octopus.
This year begins pretty early on January 20th, although this one did get a showing in 1935 on Christmas Eve, but it was formally released here. It's The Invisible Ray. We begin with an astronomer named Janos, and he's made this massive telescope to look out into space, and the doc is, of course, Boris Karloff for his first appearance of the year. And he's pretty free of makeup and just sporting this wild curly hairdo. A couple of his skeptical peers come to his house to observe his experiments, and one of them is Boris's rival, Bela Lugosi. So this year starts off with one appearance for each of them. The whole theory is that he can use his telescope to photograph light from other galaxies, and he can use them to see into the past. And they are able to witness a huge meteor land in Africa millions of years ago. They all want to find the meteor site, so they head off to Africa, and Janos finds it, and apparently a big old sparkler. He uses part of it to make a big, invisible ray, but oops, the radiation has made him glow in the dark, and if he touches something, it dies, kind of like David Gordon Green. He seeks help from Bennett, and he agrees, but the effects of the Radium X is also driving the permed doc mad. And this was directed by Lambert Hillier, and this is the first time that we're seeing him on the project, but this guy was very, very busy, and we'll actually see him again pretty shortly. He's also the man who directed the very first live-action Batman in a 15-part serial in 1943. This film was from Universal, and they wanted to get Karloff and Lugosi together again, since the pair did very well for them by this point, and they were planning to do a version of Bluebeard with them, but when that fell through, they pushed this into production. It was a troubled shoot since the original writer and director was Stuart Walker, and he didn't like the script he was given and asked for a mere 3-day delay to work on it, and the studio said no, so he walked. At this point, Hillier was brought on, and because of the special effects and other issues during filming, it went over budget and schedule, costing about 1/3 higher than originally expected. What's interesting is that this was a period in which science fiction themes would start to fall out of favor, and as such, this film wasn't that well received, and merely performed okay. It would go to mostly be regarded as a smaller blip on the Universal scope. And I give this 3 reels out of 5. This is good, and I like the aspect of watching Karloff's descent in his downfall, but it's just sort of missing something, and I feel like it doesn't explore some of the more interesting notions it brings up in favor of just standard killer stuff. Its horror cultural significance is a 2.5 since it was part of the Universal thing and had 2 big guns of horror, but it just never took off and didn't make the impact that the others did. Should you watch it? Yeah, anytime Karloff and Lugosi get together, it's worth your time.
Yes, you're right.
2 months later, on March 14th, although it had a premiere 2 weeks earlier on March 1st, we got our next entry, and it's one with a very familiar sounding name, since it's The Walking Dead. It's got a court case with a guy named Martin, and he's got connections, and everyone is saying that the judge can't convict him, and he's getting threats even. The judge ignores that and puts him away for 10 years, and the mob decides to get revenge by killing him and framing a man named John Ellman for the crime. Ellman is Karloff again for appearance number 2 here, and they go through with it and poor John is convicted, even though that there's a young couple that know that he didn't do it, but they're too afraid to speak out. He spends some time in jail and is then executed via electric chair, and the couple fesses up, and they try to stop the execution, but are too late. Dr. Beaumont here decides to try to help out and makes Ellman a part of one of his experiments, which bears a striking resemblance to some other Karloff situation, restoring him to life. But he's seemingly had his memory wiped out, but seems to have an aggression towards those that were responsible for his prison stay, and then starts getting his revenge, one by one. And this is another by Michael Curtiz, his fourth film on the project. We've seen him already with The Mad Genius, Dr. X, and The Mystery of the Wax Museum. He did this movie after doing Captain Blood, the super influential Errol Flynn film, and was hired based on a small 6-page draft of a script, and he took this job and shot the film as quickly as possible because he wanted to move on to films that he was more interested in making. Right before shooting, Karloff expressed some problems that he had with his character and felt that there were too many similarities to Frankenstein. Originally, the character was meant to not speak and simply grunted, much like the monster. Also, in the original version, his character was supposed to jump around like Tarzan and show supernatural agility, but Karloff thought it would look silly, and he asked them to change it. So they quickly brought on more writers to make the adjustments. It seems as if it did fine, since it cost around $200K and earned around $300K, so it did make them money, even if critics at the time didn't really rave about it. And I like this fine. It's another 3. I feel the same way here as I did with The Invisible Ray. It's doing enough to keep it interesting and engaging, but it just doesn't feel all that special. Its significance is another 2.5, since it's Curtiz with Karloff and has a bit of notoriety, even if it's hard to search for it without a certain something else showing up. Should you watch it? Yeah, indeed. Another 2 months passed, and we get our next entry on May 11th. We've already seen Universal's sequel to Frankenstein, but now it's the Count's turn, since we have Dracula's Daughter. It picks up right where Dracula left off, with Renfield dead and Van Helsing having just staked the vamp, and Edward Van Sloan returns as the good doc. He's arrested for the killings, and the head of Scotland Yard tells him he's going to have to try him, and Van Helsing asks for a psychiatrist named Garth in lieu of a lawyer. But then, a mysterious woman shows up and wants to claim the body of Dracula, although I suppose she's not so mysterious if you've just looked at the damn title of the movie. She's Countess Maria Zaleska, and she's ecstatic that Drac is dead and hopes her vampirism is cured. But her manservant Sandor tells her it's not. And yep, she's out on the street claiming some victims by hypnotizing them with this honkin' big jewel. She knows all the lines.
Thank you, I never drink wine.
And see, even in the 1930s, they were doing little sequel references like, oh, hey, remember that?
The Countess moves into the social scene, meeting up with Dr. Garth, and starts her own rivalry while also taking a particular liking to a young woman named Lily. And yes, this was Universal's second episode of Dracula, the official sequel, and it was a complicated start. It seems that this film was to be based on a portion of Bram Stoker's book that didn't make the publication, called Dracula's Guest. It was meant to be the first chapter of the book, and MGM actually purchased the rights to it. They were worried about making it into a film due to the legal issues with the name Dracula because of Universal's film. Universal ended up having to buy the rights from them. And in order to make it, they had to begin filming before February of 1936, so they rushed this into production. Even though it was said to be based on that story, it also borrows quite a bit from Carmilla, another vampire story focusing on a woman bloodsucker. And it was directed by, what do you know, Lambert Hillier again. Because I told you this guy had a busy 36. It was meant to be handled by James Whale, but he didn't really want to do it, and they had to essentially coerce him to do so. But he then was free to do a different project that he was excited about and chose that instead. Lugosi was originally intended to return for the film, but in the end, he only made a sort of cameo in that they used a wax bust of his image. It caused a bit of a stir because of the not-so-subtle gay subtext in the film, and the production code was very concerned about it, giving them very strict instructions on what they could or could not show. Even with that, Universal played up the fact and even used it in some of their marketing. Some reviewers at the time condemned it. The reviews were pretty good, though, and it did fairly well, although it didn't make quite as much money as its predecessor. And an interesting note is that it almost recently had a remake as the 2024 film Abigail, which began life as Dracula's daughter and was meant as a new take on this story. And this is a great follow-up. I'll give it a 3.5. The second half of the film is where everything really interesting happens, but unfortunately, it takes a little too long to get going. Its significance is a 3, since it's a part of the Universal Monsters series and a direct sequel to Dracula, but it's still a little underseen and has nowhere near the impact of the first. Should you watch it? Yes, make a date with this daughter.
Why are you looking at me that way? Won't I do? Yes, you'll do very well indeed.
And hey, speaking of sequels to movies from earlier in the 30s, our next entry arrived on June 4th, and it was Revolt of the Zombies. It's set in World War I, and on the front, they're discussing this priest who has the secret of the zombies and can mesmerize men and get them into the war. And the soldier gets shot and just keeps on coming. When he refuses to reveal the secret to zombification, they put him into jail for life. The secret is connected to this parchment, which he tries to burn, but he's then killed, and it's taken by General Mazovia. When the war ends, a group is sent into Cambodia to try to find and eliminate the parchment and make sure that no one else can create zombies. There's a young woman here named Claire, and Armand proposes to her, but she's actually in love with Clifford, but she accepts anyway with the intention of getting under his skin. He figures out pretty quickly who his fiancée really digs, so he breaks it off. So her and Cliff get it going, which of course makes Army a little marmy. He then discovers a secret temple and follows one of the priests, and they walk in front of a screen projection, which is pretty hilarious because it's very clear that they're not really in the water here. He discovers the secret and starts to be corrupted by the power. And here's the thing, this is actually meant to be a sequel to White Zombie, and was also directed by Victor Halperin, who did that one as well. Originally, it was meant to bring back Lugosi, but then as things got closer to actually being in production, he was no longer mentioned in association with it, which makes this the second film in a row that was a sequel to one of his films that he was meant to return in, and yet didn't. What's even crazier is that the company who helped to fund White Zombie decided that they wanted to flex their contract, which stated that they had exclusive rights to use the word zombie in the movie title. They even sent out letters to theaters to say that if they screened this film, they would sue them. The premiere was actually delayed while a judge sorted things out, but they did a handful of screenings under the new name Revolt of the Demons, and eventually the court found in favor of the financiers and awarded them some money, and had the addendum that Halperin was not allowed to promote this film as a sequel of any sort to White Zombie. So this became its own thing, and whereas it was once meant as a loose sequel, the law ended up making it a separate, unrelated film about human zombies. It's not really said how well it performed, but the reviews were not good, and it's often thought of as a poor follow-up to the original film, if it can be called one at all. And yeah, this is a drag, and I'm going with a 2. It's just so dull, and so much less interesting than the first one. Its significance is only a 1.5 since it's an afterthought to White Zombie, doesn't do much with the genre, and outside of Halperin, doesn't have any horror vets involved. Should you watch it? You can probably skip this. This next one arrived in the UK on June 29th, even though it had a premiere a little earlier on in March 2nd. And it would eventually make its way to the States in 1939, but it's The Demon Barber of Fleet Street, or Sweeney Todd, the Demon Barber of Fleet Street. We kick off with the barber telling his patron a story, and it flashes back to the 1800s. And we meet Sweeney Todd, and he seems pretty obsessed with people's throats, which isn't creepy at all. Random people talk about how good he is at being a barber and shaving, but stop short of calling him the throat goat, because he's no Nancy Reagan. There's also a young couple, Johanna and Mark, and they're in love, but Mark is too poor for Johanna's dad. Todd sucks up to her pops and then takes on a new apprentice with a little boy, and Todd is played by Todd Slaughter, who is really well known in the British scene as a guy who could really play an over-the-top psycho, mostly on stage, but he had film success as well. There's a shop next door that sells meat pies and is run by Mrs. Lovett, and they have a devious arrangement. What he does is he gets a rich jerk in his chair and then pulls this lever that dumps them down into the basement, killing them. Mrs. Lovett then does her part, and they rob them, split the money, and she disposes of the bodies. And of course, this was based on the classic Penny Dreadful tale of Sweeney Todd, who first appeared in a serial called String of Pearls back in 1846. This was actually the third version of the tale to be put on screen, with two previous British efforts coming in 1926 and 28. They were both silent though, and one was only a 15-minute short, so this is the first full-length with sound take on the film. The version that I think that most are familiar with, the Sondheim musical, wouldn't exist until the 70s, but there were a number of stage shows through the years, several before this film. It was directed by George King, who did a run of films, although not many of great mention, and nothing horror outside of this. Since this is only an hour long, several elements were stripped out of the story, streamlining it quite a bit and eliminating some characters entirely. It got a bit of attention, although not all that much, with most just recognizing the fun performance by Slaughter, who was essentially the UK's most known horror star. And this is fun. I give it a 3. Slaughter is clearly having a ball, and I like the story, but it's happening all so fast that it's missing some of what makes the tale so interesting in the first place. The significance is a 2, since it's the first full take on the classic tale and has Slaughter involved, but is definitely one of the less spoken of takes on this. Should you watch it? Sure! Order a meat pie and put it on.
There's the penny I gave you. That's a good boy.
Let's go back to the US now and move into July here as we look at July 10th, and it's the release of The Devil Doll. This has a couple of prison escapees, and one of them is Marcel. He's a scientist, and the other is Paul, played by Lionel Barrymore, who we last saw in The Mark of the Vampire. And they go to Marcel's laboratory, where his wife is excited to see him return. She's taken on a helper, who they refer to as an inbred with mental deficiencies. And Marcel's experiments were focused on shrinking things down to 1/6 of their actual size, so the humans would be able to stretch out the Earth's resources. They test it out on Lachna, and it makes her smarter, but the doc has a heart attack and dies. Turns out that Paul was wrongly accused of robbing his own bank, and his associates that set him up are worried that he's out there, but he's disguised himself as an old woman and has teamed up with Melita to get revenge on them. But that's not his only goal. He also wants to make sure that his estranged daughter is taken care of. And she's Maureen O'Sullivan, most known for being Jane in a whole bunch of Tarzan movies. But she was also in Hannah and Her Sisters and Peggy Sue Got Married. And this is another one from the great Todd Browning, and it's the 4th film he'd done in the 30s. And will be the final time that we cover him here. After this, he would only make one more film in 1939 that was a crime thriller, and then he'd retire and live the rest of his life in seclusion. The story bore a mild resemblance to one of Browning's earlier films, one from 1925 called The Unholy Three. In that one, a character also disguises himself as an elderly woman who owns a shop, much like Paul does here. And the story was actually adapted out of a novel called Burn Witch Burn from 1925, although quite a few of the story details were changed, although they share the element of revenge via an old woman who runs a doll shop. And this did get some good notes from critics admiring the integration of the special effects, but it wasn't a hit. It seems as if it did well enough to not be considered a disaster, although it also appears to have not been profitable. And this is silly and fun, and I give it a 3.5. Barrymore as the old woman is pretty wild, and the special effects are solid for the era. Its significance is a 2.5 since it was Browning's last dip into horror and had Barrymore in it, and has since increased in notoriety and gained a nice cult following. Should you watch it? Yeah, be a doll. We jump ahead now to September 11th in London for a film that did get a run about 2 months later on November 1st, and it's The Man Who Lived Again, or The Man Who Changed His Mind, depending upon which country you were in. Dr. Wyatt here, played by Anna Lee, who was Sister Margareta from The Sound of Music, is leaving her role as a surgeon to go work with a hotshot scientist and help him with his research. His other assistant is the wheelchair-bound Clayton, and the doc himself, once again, is Boris Karloff for his third role of the year. Lawrence has lost his status in the scientific community and is a disgrace due to his wild theories, which revolve around trying to extract the information from the human brain and store it like electricity. They test it out on a chimp and then reverse the connection and swap minds with a different one, and he claims he can do the same with humans. When he goes public with it, he's mocked by the community, and he's falling for Claire, but soon goes off the deep end. He swaps Clayton's brain with a rich man and uses his wealth to further his experiments even more. And then, he decides to set his sights on swapping with Claire's boyfriend, Dick, in order to woo her. And,
I get it. The Man Who Changed His Mind. Pretty clever movie.
And this one was made in England and was Karloff's second feature there after The Ghoul, but he had a much better experience with this one, mainly due to not having to wear tons of makeup. The director here is a wild one since it was a very early work from Robert Stevenson. And if you know that name, you'll be saying, what? Making a horror movie? And if you don't know that name, well, he's one of the foremost live-action Disney directors of later years. Are you ready for this? This is the man who made Old Yeller, Darby O'Gill and the Little People, The Absent-Minded Professor, Son of Flubber, Mary freaking Poppins, The Love Bug, Bedknobs and Broomsticks, and even Shaggy DA. Basically, if there was a kids flick that was connected to Disney in the 60s or early 70s, Stevenson was behind it. This wasn't really a big hit, although it did get some note and became a more important film in hindsight than it did at the time. And I had a great time with this, so I'll put it at a 3.5. I wish that it got to the brain swap stuff a little quicker, but it's so fun to watch Karloff let loose. Its significance is just a 2 though, since it's not well known at all, but with Karloff involved and an early film from Stevenson, it does deserve some credit. Should you watch it? No? Okay, yes, I've changed my mind. Next up is our final movie for 1936, and it's also from England, and also a movie I shouldn't really include because it's not horror. And it came out on December 6th in the UK, and in the US a little later in January of 1937. And I'm basically including it to make one joke because it's Sabotage. Someone put sand into a generator to cause a blackout, and they determined that it's Sabotage! A theater owner named Verloc shows up, and he has sand on his hands because he was responsible for the Sabotage! Verloc's wife is friendly with the shopkeeper next door, who turns out to be a member of Scotland Yard, and has been keeping tabs on him. Verloc meets up with his contact, who isn't quite satisfied with the short-term nature of his and is instructed to place a bomb near Piccadilly Circus. Lockie belongs to this group of terrorists, and when Detective Spencer is eavesdropping on them, they catch him and identify him. And that kicks off a tense countdown as it gets close to that bomb time, with the detective on the case, with Verloc knowing that he's closing in and trying to prevent his next act of Sabotage! And the reason for including this, besides making the same joke over and over, is my tradition of tracking the early career of horror master Alfred Hitchcock. And this was another of his films that was meant to be based on a book, but then just went into its own direction. It was meant to be an adaptation of The Secret Agent, a novel from 1907, which is about a woman discovering her husband is a terrorist. And he's a theater owner there, but that's where most of the similarities end. I should also point out that Hitch did actually make a second film this year called Secret Agent, but this was the more noted of the two, and besides, I can't make as many jokes about that one's title, although, come to think of it, I guess I could have just played Secret Agent Man a few times.
Ah, well. Shoulda, coulda, woulda. Just a little bit of self.
Apparently, with this one, the director wanted to use Robert Donat again, as he had previously been in the 39 Steps, but there was different explanations as to why he didn't. He either couldn't cast him because of Donat's chronic asthma, or the actor was under contract elsewhere and wasn't able to be released from it. Either way, they cast John Loder as Spencer, but Hitchcock didn't like him and claimed that he wasn't suitable for the role and that he had to constantly rewrite his dialogue to make it work. It was pretty heavily praised and features some fantastically suspenseful moments, like a boy holding the bomb unknowingly and having to wait and watch a parade go by while it's in his arms. It has a moment that the director regrets as an innocent character dies, and he later says that it went against his rules that tension needs to have a release. And people were harsh on him for the death. Although it wasn't as big of a hit or elaborate as some others from that time frame, it was still very successful and made a big dent. And this is a good flick, but does feel a bit lightweight for Hitch, and I give it a 3.5. It has some outstanding sequences in it, but just overall doesn't leave as big of an impact. Its HCS is a 2.5 since it is a Hitchcock movie, but didn't land as big or important as some other of his, and again, isn't horror. Should you watch it? Yeah, if you don't, I'll scream.
Because we believe there's something going on here connected with
Sabotage.
that blackout the other night, you remember?
Well, my husband hasn't anything to do with sabotage.
So there are only a couple of films in 1937, and most aren't from the US, since the Hays Code meant not a lot was being made in terms of horror. But in Germany, on January 12th, The Hound of the Baskervilles was released. It starts with Lord Baskerville, and he's a jealous old man, and in the middle of the party, kills someone for dallying with his wife. He then tries to kill her, but is stopped by his massive hound dog. It then jumps ahead to modern times, and the castle is still haunted by the howling of the hound, and the current lord, Charles Baskerville, gets a mysterious phone call, and then goes outside, only to then be found dead. At a will reading, it's revealed that there's a nephew named Henry that no one knew about, and he'll take ownership of the castle, but they're afraid that he'll also fall victim to the hound. To prevent that, they call in the famed Sherlock Holmes and his assistant, Watson. They head off to the Baskervilles to solve the mystery of what's going on. And, again, this is an adaptation of the 1902 story with the same name by Arthur Conan Doyle. This is the first version that we're fully covering on the project, even though there was a film from the UK in 1932, but that one is lost and no longer exists. Beyond that, there were several earlier takes on the story, going all the way back to 1914, and most were from Germany as well. So they have a particular love for this mystery. But what's strange, I guess, is that this is the first film that we're covering that took place under Nazi Germany, and there was a particular distaste for the British. So doing a film about Holmes seemed like an odd choice. That may be why this take on the detective is very unusual. He doesn't even appear until a third of the way into the film, and his personality is a bit toned down. It was directed by Karl Lamak, and he was Czech and had great success with his films in Germany. But the rise of the Nazis made it tougher for him to work there. And about a year after this film, he would head off to the Netherlands to continue his career. One minor bit of interest is the notion that when the Allies found Hitler's bunker after he shot himself, they found only 2 films there, and this was one of them. And this is alright, I'm going to give it a 2.5. It takes way too long to get through the setup, and then just kind of lollygags. It has some good stuff going on here and there, though. Its significance is just a 1, even though it's a rather famous story, but it's a version that no one really knows about, and doesn't feature any horror stars of note, or at all. Should you watch it, you can pass and move on to one of the other adaptations. So this one is different because for the first time in the 30s, we're headed to China for a film that has no clear release date, except that it came out in China in February of 1937. There's a poster up talking about a theater that is set to be demolished and a small theater troupe that is putting on a play there. They arrive and it's falling apart and spooky inside. And when they start to rehearse, their star, Sun, is having trouble with his lines. He stays behind to practice alone, but a mysterious voice rings out and appears to be trying to teach him. With the voice's help, he's able to perfect his craft and discovers that his mysterious teacher is Song Damping, a famous performer who was thought to have died ages ago. We then flash back to Song's heyday, and he had a pretty troubled life in that he was secretly a revolutionary fighter and also in love with Lee, and their relationship was disapproved of by her father. He's captured and beaten with a whip, and then attacked and burned with acid. He's horribly disfigured, so he figures that Lee is better off without him. He tells her that he is dead, which drives her insane. Back in the present, he tells Sun that he now hides in the theater, and he can still be near her there, and every night at midnight, he sings her a song. But then things get sticky when Sun agrees to go to her and pose as Damping to help her out, but also his old rival sees the show and causes his own set of troubles. And this is a film with some historic merit because not only is this the first Chinese horror film, but it's also the first horror musical and was the work of Ma Zhu Weibang, and he'd become known for doing works of horror after this. It was very loosely based on the Phantom of the Opera, incorporating the concept of the burned man living in the halls of the theater and haunting it, but also adding its own elements. As such, it is the first full-length adaptation of Phantom with sound. It was a controversial film since it featured the revolutionaries as heroic and preceded yet another revolution there. Weibang had to work very diligently with the writer in order to make sure that the aspects of their script would pass the censor board. It was a massive sensation and earned a ton of money, mainly due to its promotional tactics and the rumor that a mere poster for the film was enough to scare a small child to death. They advertised it as being unsuitable for any child under 6 years old, and they weren't admitted, which got people curious to see this oh-so-scary film. It was popular enough to get a sequel in 1941 called Song of Midnight 2, and it was also remade a whole lot of times. There were versions in 56, 62, 85, and then a version called The Phantom Lover in 1995 by Ronnie Yu, and then another in 2005. And this is a 3.5 for me. This is a great early take on the tale, and more elaborate than I was expecting, and moody as hell. Sure, it's not really all that scary and is more melodramatic, but I think it was a little more advanced than its American counterparts at the time. Its significance is just a 2 though, since it's pretty unknown in the US and doesn't really feature any horror names, but has earned a cult following and was the first sound phantom take. This is another that has a massive significance in its home country, but just not as much here. Should you watch it? Yep, give this song a listen. The final international film of the year had an unknown release date, except knowing that it was in the UK and it was at some point in October, and it's The Ticket of Leave Man. There's a story of an infamous killer named the Tiger, and he's on the loose, just choking and smacking dudes on the head. The Tiger is once again Todd Slaughter for his second appearance here so far, and he's a little more subtle looking right here. He becomes enamored with a singer, but she's taken, and her fiancé is ready to take her away from this all. The Tiger frames her guy with some forged notes, and poor Robert is arrested, and he then manipulates things so that he's blamed for being the Tiger. He then starts a charity in order to take advantage of little old ladies, and Robs does his time, all the while that the Tiger tries to move in on May to no avail. Robert is released on leave in these dazzling jammies, and I guess when you're released from jail, it's called Ticket of Leave, hence the title. What's worse is that there's this little kid in the beginning, and it's part of how he ends up in jail, and when he gets out, he runs into the same kid, and he looks exactly the same age, so I guess he wasn't in jail for long, but they act like he's been there for a really long time. He then sets out to clear his own name and also find the Tiger. And this is by George King. He's the same man that also made the Demon Barber that we talked about earlier in this very episode. This was based on a play from 1863 with the same name, and it introduced a character called Hawkshaw, the detective, who would then become a long-running comic strip character in cartoon form. And what's weird is that this is pretty similar to Sweeney Todd here, in that it's Todd Slaughter playing a creepster with a thing for a much younger woman, and is a devious killer who is hiding in plain sight by working in a rather common business. And this one is not great. I'm going to go with a 2. It's way too little plot, and even at an hour and 10 minutes, it feels very stretched out. Its significance is just a 1, since it's not known at all, and the only real claim to fame is Slaughter, and he's still a very cult figure. Should you watch it? You can leave it. We're going to end 1937 back in the United States with a film that arrived on December 11th. And it's another that's perhaps outside of the purview of this series, but it's the Octopus. We're at this remote lighthouse, and Mr. Morgan here is the new owner, and then there's these 2 goofy cops named Kelly and Dempsey, and the police are all on the lookout for a crime boss named the Octopus. They're stopped by a random woman who tells them that there's a murder at the lighthouse and that the Octopus is there. And sure enough, Mr. Morgan spots a dead body and some tentacles. Pretty soon, a wacky group of characters all converge on the place, including Captain Hook here. And it appears that one of them may be the master criminal themselves. Wacky shenanigans ensue when it turns out that that's not a body up there after all. It's just a dummy. And if you haven't guessed by now, this is mainly a comedy. But it's also one with a giant octopus attacking. And by attacking, I mean just sort of poking its testicles through doorways. But Kelly and Dempsey are no Bud and Lou. In fact, the 2 actors here, Hugh Herbert and Alan Jenkins, appeared in a total of 10 pictures together, but they were never featured as a comic duo, with the exception of this one. And it was by William McGann, and he started making films in the early 30s, and most of them were crime or comedy oriented, much like this one. He would end up switching gears in the 40s and moving away from directing, taking on the role of special effects guy in a number of films. This one was based on 2 different plays, and one was The Gorilla, which was already adapted back in 1930 in a film that I mentioned but couldn't cover since it's a lost film. The other play was called Shh, the Octopus, and that's where the name came from. And this one wasn't really much of a big sensation, although it was somewhat successful. And you may be wondering why I included this comedy crime caper film here. And well, I mean, I've been putting some Hitchcock movies in these things, so I guess there's really no rules anymore. But first of all, this one has a giant octopus in it, so it's got some creature action going for it. But then there's the main reason why this film has earned a small note in modern history. But I apologize because it sort of spoils one of the big reveals. But there's no way that I'm not going to discuss this awesomeness. When the octopus is revealed to be Old Nanny, check out how they show her transformation.
You're right, Mr. Morgan. I have a pair of arms for each of you. Arms that...
Now, this astounding effect can only be done in black and white, since they did her up in makeup that was one single color. They then used a color filter on the camera, which covered and hid the makeup since they were the same tone. Then, during the shot, they would remove the filter, which then exposed the makeup. It's just astounding looking, and something similar was previously used in Jekyll and Hyde, but this is one of the smoothest uses of the effect. One whose simplicity can no longer be achieved without the use of black and white film. And we'll close out this year with a 3. This is pretty fun, but gets a little lost in the middle of it, but it starts fun and ends strong. Its significance is just a 1.5 since it's mostly not talked about and didn't really have much of an impact, and only really gets talked about when someone wants to highlight that amazing practical effect. Should you watch it? Sure, it's worth a watch and a laugh.
So there you have it, all of the movies of both 1936 and 1937. And I think my favorite in this block was probably Devil Doll. It was just kind of bizarre and weird and fun, and I really enjoyed what it was doing because it was constantly throwing something different at me. But let me know down below in the comments which of these was your favorite, which of these you've seen, and which of these you'd now like to see. And as always, hit the like button if you enjoyed the video, hit the subscribe button if you enjoy what you see on the channel, and go to my Patreon page at patreon.com/movietimelines and help support this channel and keep the project going, because there's only one episode left right here on the 30s Project.